Professor Thomas S. Kidd, opens his newest book, a biography of Thomas Jefferson, this way. This is a biography of a brilliant but troubled person. Thomas Jefferson would seem to need no introduction, yet among the founding fathers, he is the greatest enigma and the greatest source of controversy. Professor Kidd also writes Jefferson left a massive collection of carefully curated papers, but he seems virtually unknowable as a man. Mr. Jefferson was our third president and the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. Professor Thomas Kidd, why did you open your book on Thomas Jefferson by saying this is a biography of a brilliant but troubled person?
Well, I think that it's my way of acknowledging that Jefferson is as brilliant as he's touted to be. I think there's been a lot of criticism of the Founding Fathers, understandably, in recent years, but there's no doubt that Jefferson is, I think, the most brilliant writer and probably thinker of the founding generation. But that does not mean that his life always matched up with his rhetoric, and I think that's one of the great questions that we have about Jefferson these days. Is it's kind of the how could he question. He's the one who said all men are created equal, and yet his life, especially as it related to his enslaved people, didn't seem to match up to that idea. And so I'm trying in this book to see how his life matched up or did not match up with his stated beliefs, and to the extent that his life didn't match up with it, to just try to understand where that kind of incoherence and just a bunch of contradictions, where did that actually come from in his life?
Where did you get the idea?
Well, in some ways, it's a cultural question in our moment that we don't really know what to do with the Founding Fathers, in particular, I think Jefferson, because we've looked to him as our kind of lodestar as far as the meaning of the American experiment, that all men are created equal. And Lincoln turned to that passage. Martin Luther King Jr. turned to that passage to help Americans understand the meaning of their nation and the American experiment. And yet we look at the personal biography of someone like Jefferson, and frankly, it's a mess. I mean, there's just so many problems ethically, but just in terms of consistency. And so I didn't feel like there was there are plenty of Jefferson biographies. They tend to be, hitting the highlights of his political career, which is a perfectly understandable and valid way to do it. But I didn't feel like there was a book that looked at that issue of his inconsistency between his stated beliefs and then the way that he actually lived. But that in a way is the most pressing question of our cultural moment.
Out front, you have a quote, Thomas Jefferson on Elite Virginians, 1785. I'll read it. I have thought them aristocratical, pompous, clannish, indolent, hospitable, and thoughtless in their expenses. Based on what I've read in your book, how can he hold them thoughtless in their expenses?
Yes, well, that is one of the great inconsistencies of Jefferson's life, is that he always professed to believe in the virtue of frugality. And in fact, when you see Jefferson quoted on social media these days, it is often his quotes about being sensible in your expenses, and yet he was totally undisciplined in the way that he actually lived and consumed and built multiple mansions and on and on and on. And so I think that quote suggests that even Jefferson realized that there was a kind of cultural trap of Virginia genteel culture that he was brought into. And like a lot of issues in Jefferson's life, he could state what the ethical problem was, but he found it much more difficult to escape the trap himself.
You point out in his book, and there's a thread, and I want you to talk about this, that at the end of his life, he was, based on today's dollar, $2.6 million in debt.
Yes, he is now. Many of the founding fathers, and I know you just recently did an episode on this. Many of the founding fathers were in debt. This was not unusual, but Jefferson was a special case. Let's say that he really, by the end of his life in particular, he is under such a crippling load of personal debt. It's so bad that he really struggles to even understand what has happened to him financially. And he talks all the time to his daughter, for instance, about how much he longs to be out from under the burden of these debts, but he can't ever do it. And it starts with his marriage to his wife Martha, and when he marries Martha, he inherits her father's debts. And so he goes into his marriage with inheriting land and enslaved people, but also responsibility for a number of debts. And he makes some progress from time to time on paying off those debts, but he can't ever seem to get his own spending under control. He's constantly complaining that he's not paid enough by Congress in his various diplomatic and presidential duties to cover his expenses. And then what he called the coup de grace, and it certainly was that, is that he co-signed a loan for one of his friends in Virginia politics, a huge loan in the late 18 teens. And then that person ended up almost immediately dying and leaving Jefferson with responsibility for the debt. And since he had about 7 years left to go in his life, he was never going to get anywhere close to paying off all the debts that he owed.
You also have a quote in there from John Quincy Adams when Thomas Jefferson left the Secretary of State's job. And John Quincy Adams says, Mr. Jefferson has a habit as well as a disposition to expensive living, and his salary was not adequate to his luxury. He could not subdue his pride and vanity as I have done, and proportion his style of life to his revenue. What was the relationship? I know we've heard many times about John Adams, but his son, why is he being critical here in this particular quote?
Well, the Adamses had a tense relationship with Jefferson, especially starting in the 1800 presidential election, in which Jefferson defeated Adams as the sitting president, and Jefferson becomes president. Because of the nastiness of those elections in which Jefferson and Adams faced off, they had a background of political conflict, but there also came a dynamic of John Adams and then John Quincy Adams being critical of the way that Jefferson lived on a number of fronts. And John Adams had seen this. They were both serving from time to time in the American Diplomatic Corps in Europe. And the Adamses just came to believe that Jefferson was wildly undisciplined in the way that he lived. Now, to be fair, diplomats are always expected to be hospitable and do a lot of entertaining and hosting, but Jefferson seemed to really relish that role, especially when he was in Paris. I think his time in Paris is when he really caught the bug for this kind of luxurious living with European wines and so forth. And so Jefferson always attributed the problem to his lack of income, but Adams, in his kind of New England Puritan kind of way, thought that there was a more fundamental problem of character and lack of discipline, that you just simply at some point have to be realistic about what your income is and then try to live within your means as best you can. Now, Jefferson would have agreed with that principle in theory, but he never seemed to be able to manifest it in reality.
On Professor Thomas Kidd, that's you. Where do you teach?
Well, I have taught for 20 years at Baylor University in Texas, but I am, as we speak, in the midst of transitioning to Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City.
Tell us about that institution.
It is mostly a pastoral training institution, and I'm going to be teaching a lot of courses in church history and religious history, and one of my courses is going to be on religion and the American founding, which is obviously intersects with the topic of this book.
And what denomination or what part of religion does this institute follow?
It is Baptist, and so most of the students at the seminary are either Baptist pastors or plan to be Baptist pastors or missionaries. And so a lot of Christian denominations, of course, think about the idea of having their pastors trained in church history. And so that's the hat that I'm going to be wearing mostly at the seminary, is training pastors to be conversant with church history.
How important is Baptist religion at Baylor?
Well, Baylor was founded in 1845 by a group of an association of Baptist educators wanting to have Baptist education on the then Texas frontier, and so it's deeply ingrained in the historic mission of what Baylor is all about. Now, of course, many of the students and many of the faculty are not Baptists themselves, but we at Baylor try to hire people who take their Christian faith seriously, or Judaism in the case of Jewish faculty, and so it's historically very important at Baylor.
This is just a minor note. I'm doing research for our chat. I looked up Baylor, and there was a question about whether or not you have to be Christian to go to Baylor, and it suggested that you do. Is that still the case?
So to work at Baylor, to teach at Baylor, you do have to either be Christian or Jewish, but there are no standards or tests of faith for the student body.
Why the limit to just Baptist or Jewish religion, or Christian? I guess it's Christian or Jewish.
Right. It's any Christian denomination in general is fine, and it's because if we're going to have distinctively Christian education, the people teaching it should be able to represent that tradition.
But you got your PhD at the University of Notre Dame.
Yes.
How does that? I mean, are you a Baptist?
I'm a Baptist myself, yes, and so I was part of the Protestant cohort there at Notre Dame, which was quite lively when I was there, for sure. And I think Baylor and Notre Dame, I think institutionally, historically, are somewhat similar in that both of them have aspirations of being a top-tier research university, but in the Christian tradition. And in Notre Dame's case, centered on the Catholic tradition, and at Baylor, Baptist.
Are you a Baptist since you were born?
No, I grew up a United Methodist, but came over to Baptist convictions when I was in college.
The reason I'm asking all these questions is I want to get to the Thomas Jefferson connection in your book to religion. How much did that play a role in getting you to write about that? And what did you find out about Jefferson and religion?
Well, like on the financial issue, Jefferson is very complicated in terms of his religious views, and my own personal faith certainly helped to prompt me to be interested in Jefferson's religion, and more generally, I mean, a number of my books have been about religion and faith in the American founding period, which is such a controversial issue historically these days. Is America a Christian nation? Is the founding basically a secular enterprise? And so I'm trying to answer some of those questions through the lens of Jefferson's own story. And what I came to find out is that Jefferson is just very difficult to pin down in terms of, especially if you want to apply today's categories to the past. I mean, Jefferson just is very different from most people on the American religious and political landscape today, because he is definitely skeptical about basic Christian doctrine. From certainly his teen years, he is skeptical about the authority of the Bible. He's skeptical about Jesus's divinity, and really comes to believe that there is effectively no supernatural realm at all. But he's very attracted to Jesus's moral teachings, and comes to believe, by the time he's president, Jefferson comes to believe that Jesus is not only a great moral teacher, but that he is the greatest moral teacher in human history. And so when Jefferson, what he will say in his correspondence, I am a Christian, but what he means by that is only in an ethical, naturalistic kind of sense. And so you have to, today we tend to, grab onto certain snippets and quotes from the Founding Fathers' vast body of works, but you have to really hang in there with the nuance of what Jefferson believed, that he would say he was a Christian. He didn't call himself a deist. I mean, we often say that he was a deist, but he called himself a Christian, but I think it was only in a naturalistic, moral sense, and not adhering to any of the kind of supernatural claims about Christianity.
Chapter 11. The Jefferson Bible was known only to a small circle of Jefferson friends during his lifetime. What is the Jefferson Bible?
Well, the Jefferson Bible is his project of compiling the sort of greatest hits of Jesus's moral teachings from the Gospels. So it's not the whole Bible, it's just the four canonical Gospels. And he is literally snipping out with scissors or a penknife the passages from the Gospels that he thinks are reflecting the true teachings of Jesus, and leaving behind, Jefferson is leaving behind, in effect, the supernatural claims. Now, it's difficult for Jefferson to adhere to this rule entirely strictly. So there are some passages in the Jefferson Bible that have some supernatural content. But for the most part, what the Jefferson Bible, and he did this twice, but we have the text of only the second Jefferson Bible. What you basically have is the Gospels with the miracles taken out, and things like angels doing things. He didn't care for that, and didn't think that was true. And so he cuts out those passages from the Gospels and basically leaves in the ethical content. And he explained to correspondents that he trusted to talk to about this, because he knew that this would be very controversial if word got out that he was cutting out parts of the Bible. He said that doing this kind of cut and paste job was like picking out diamonds from a dunghill. He thought Jesus' moral teachings were the diamonds, and the rest of the Bible was a veritable dunghill.
You write the parables, the Sermon on the Mount, and similar passages were key because they demonstrated Jefferson believed the kind of moral behavior God required for salvation. In contrast to the classic Protestant belief in salvation by grace alone, Jefferson believed that God would save people who behaved morally. And you know why I'm going to read that and what I'm going to ask you next. You read your book, and morals come up quite often. How does it work out for him on that subject?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of problems. That's for sure. I mean, I wish that Jefferson gave more direct attention to his moral philosophy, which he would have regarded as a Christian moral philosophy, and then how he actually lived. Ben Franklin famously had his kind of inventory of virtues, and he from time to time in his life would track his own sense of how he's doing about complying with basically Christian virtues, and Franklin would actually keep a journal where he would say, well, I did well with honesty and frugality, and maybe not so well with pride today, and that sort of thing. But Jefferson never really did things like that. And so I think one of the problems that you see with Jefferson is that his selectivity, I think, as far as his appropriation of what he thought was true and what was not true about Christianity, also led, in Jefferson's case, to a sort of selective application of Christian ethics and virtue. And so it is difficult to say, where it was in his life that his belief in Christian ethics actually made a significant difference in the way that he lived.
Does he deserve full credit for the Declaration of Independence?
Well, he worked with a committee that included Franklin on the Declaration of Independence, and so you can get down into the phrases and have some sense of what was from Jefferson and what was from the committee, and then what the Continental Congress at large did with the draft of the Declaration. But the bulk of it is definitely inspired by Jefferson, and he wrote a lot of the original text. There was a lot of editing that went on from the committee and from Congress. In fact, Congress took out a lengthy passage that Jefferson had written about how Britain had imposed slavery on the colonies and sort of forced American slaveholders into, like Jefferson, into this kind of bind of, they're dependent on slavery, but they can't get rid of it, and which was kind of Jefferson's standard line about. He knew that slavery was wrong, but he didn't know what American slaveholders could really do to divest themselves of slaves. And so that was kind of an awkward passage because, the obvious response was, well, if you think that slavery is wrong, why don't you free your own slaves, even if you can't do anything else about it politically? So the Congress actually cut out that whole passage and just left a couple of references to slavery in the final document. So it definitely is a work of a committee and then the Congress at large. But Jefferson is the key mind behind the Declaration of Independence.
But one of the most famous sentences in the Declaration of Independence was not written by him originally. George Mason was responsible for, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal." And if you come to Washington, I'm sure you have, and you go to the Jefferson Memorial, you can find George Mason around the corner in a little tiny spot. Doesn't get much attention. Does Jefferson deserve a 19-foot statue in this memorial in this town? We don't see anything for John Adams. You hardly see anything for George Mason. Give us your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that I'm not a fan of tearing down statues in particular. I mean, I think sometimes that's warranted. But if we are trying to look to people like Jefferson as moral exemplars, I think that is pretty problematic. I mean, Jefferson in particular, I think, has a moral track record that is less than exemplary, to put it nicely. So, I tend to think that we honor people like Jefferson to the extent that we can in terms of the ideas. And even as you said, I mean, it's not as if Jefferson came up with all these ideas himself, but his ideas, and to the extent that he was responsible for the doctrine of equality that comes out of the Declaration. I mean, that has been a force for enormous good in American history, as used by people like Lincoln and Martin Luther King. And so, I think that I'd rather that we just sort of sit with the contradictions and complexities and be humble about the problems within our American national legacy and not default to either the extremes of just kind of uncritical nationalistic patriotism or just tearing down everything about the American founding and saying that nothing good came out of it.
But as you know, there are a lot of people in this country that are cynical, including a lot of young people, when they hear the normal thing that you hear in your schools about Jefferson being the author of the Declaration of Independence and on. And now they're finding out that about the relationship with Sally Hemings. And you even point out in your book that historians have covered up this whole story for years.
Yeah. That's right, and of course that part of it is not new to me. The dividing line is really the DNA testing in the late '90s when we determined, and you have to be careful about what the DNA tests actually prove that a Jefferson male was the father of Sally Hemings' fifth child. And almost all, not 100% of Jefferson scholars and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello took that as much proof as we're going to get that Thomas Jefferson had a long-standing sexual relationship with Sally Hemings, who was also his slave and also his dead wife's half-sister, because Sally Hemings and Martha Jefferson had the same father. And so this is very troubling, and it is a reason to be at least humbled in our view of Jefferson, that not only is this not a perfect man, but that given the temptations of power and slaveholding, that he really did some terrible coercive things. Now, where I tend to I guess, draw a line is that I do not think that we should look back on the Founding Fathers for sort of to establish our own moral bona fides, as it were. This is what goes on a lot on social media and more sensational criticisms of the Founding Fathers, is that we almost kind of establish our own, morality and virtue by denouncing people in the past. And I think that is not the best approach. But part of the reason for that is I tell my students, when we come up with on the difficult subject of American slavery and the American founding, is that, the reality is we don't know if we would have done better if we were in Jefferson's position. I mean, he did some really awful things, but, do we know for sure that we would have done better? And I think it's really, to me, more of a lesson about the temptations of power. One of the many, many reasons why slavery as an institution is fundamentally immoral and coercive, and it's that if you give people that kind of power over other human beings, it will be abused. And that's just the way that human nature seems to work. And so I would rather take it in the direction of, a kind of humility about the failings of our founders, but not use it to say that we're so much better as a modern generation because we know who to denounce in the past.
The Sally Hemings story, how did she get to Paris and under what circumstances? And when did he, based on your research, start having children by her? Right.
So he had left his daughters in Virginia when he started as a diplomat in Paris, and then one of his daughters died from whooping cough, and so he wanted to bring his surviving daughter over to be with him, and so she needed a companion to come with her. Young daughter needed a companion to come with her on the transatlantic journey, and so he had suggested an older enslaved woman as the traveling companion, but that woman was not available for various reasons, and so his relatives in Virginia picked Sally Hemings to come as the traveling companion, and so her brother James was already there in Paris in Jefferson's household, and so it may have actually been an appealing thing for her to come. She was a teenager at the time, and so she was able to reunite with her brother. And obviously to see Paris. And so it may have actually been somewhat appealing of a job for her to come, but it probably was within some years of her arriving in Paris, mid to late teens for Sally Hemings, that they began a sexual relationship that obviously is proceeding in a fundamentally coercive environment because she is his slave. Now in France, slavery is technically not legal, but the Parisian authorities tend to sort of overlook, say, American diplomats who brought slaves with them. But Sally Hemings was actually occasionally paid for her work in Paris, just to kind of give some cover of the fact that Jefferson had these enslaved people working for him in Paris. But we don't know for sure, and there's some disagreement among scholars about when the sexual aspect of their relationship began. But probably it began before they left Paris. We think that she was likely pregnant when that Jefferson household left Paris, and in the late 1780s. And there's some evidence to suggest from one of her children by Thomas Jefferson that she actually even had something of a choice about whether to come back with him or not to Virginia, and that she may have even extracted a promise from him that if she came with him, that he would have ultimately free any children that they had together. And if that's true, if something like that promise was made, then it's a very strange relationship to say the least. But it does look like that Jefferson fulfilled that promise in that the children who are being born to Sally Hemings that Jefferson is fathering are his slaves too, but he either frees those children in his will, or he just lets them run away and run away to freedom. And so Sally Hemings is not freed at Jefferson's death, but the children are. So very, very strange, morally, seriously problematic relationship there. But it's a long-standing relationship and apparently produces a number of children.
How many do you think they've proven that he might have had by her?
We think maybe 6, but there's always a possibility that there were, ones who went unrecorded, or there's so many children died early and so forth. But we think maybe 6.
Based on my math, he was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, 42 when he was minister to France, and between 58 and 66 when he was president of the United States, 1801 and 1809. Speaking of Sally Hemings, you point out in the book that he left her nothing in his will. He was in debt, so I don't know what he could have left her, but what's your take on that?
Well, he was in a bind, I think, about he probably thought about granting her officially her freedom as he did with 2 of their children. But if he had done that, he would have had to talk about her directly in the will. And here I'm drawing off of the work of Annette Gordon-Reed, who teaches at Harvard, who's done the best work about the Hemings-Jefferson relationship. And she points out that it is widely known by the time of Jefferson's death that this relationship existed. The news had been broken in 1802 about Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings. So this is not revisionist history to entertain this allegation, even though many historians before the DNA test just simply would not even talk about it. But he would have found it, I think, excruciating to have to name her in the will. And then under Virginia law at the time, if you're going to free any of your slaves in your will, you also have to make provision for how they're going to be able to get on as a self-sustaining person in Virginia society, or you have to figure out how to get them out of the state, because the Virginia authorities, white authorities, did not want a growing free black population in the state of Virginia. And so he made a more informal arrangement with his daughter Jefferson's daughter, that she would, quote, give Sally Hemings her time. And that was basically a kind of informal agreement to let her live as a free person. And she shows up in a census about 6 years after Jefferson's death, living as a free person in Charlottesville. So she was sort of informally, apparently, given her freedom, even though he did not want to address that in his will.
One of the things that I researched, and I want your perspective on this, is that when the election of 1800 came around and he ran for president, there were 5 million people in the United States. He got 45,467 votes to be elected president. Won 9 states, and his opponent got 7. Electoral votes, those are the number of states. The electoral votes were 73 to 65. But my question to you is, do people know that he only got 45,000 votes?
I think that at the time there would have been much more focus on the Electoral College than on, the national vote totals. And so whether or not that number was reported, I mean, I think that there was much more focus at the time on the contingency of the outcome of the Electoral College. One of the reasons why the Electoral College is so controversial today is that Americans tend to assume that it really is the national popular vote that determines the election. And that is partly because we assume that the electors from the states will follow the majority outcome of each of the states. It was much more contingent in 1800 about how the electors were going to vote. Party alignments were more fluid. And in fact, the 1800 election became, there was a tie in the Electoral College. It's incredibly complicated what happened, but ends up going into the Congress, and they take, I think, 35 votes in the House of Representatives before they are able to settle the election. So, it's arguably the most convoluted, difficult presidential election in American history. And so I think that the focus there is on the intrigues going on with John Adams, of course, is the sitting president, and it's clear that he's not going to win. But Aaron Burr has gotten involved at that point as a possible sort of dark horse candidate in the House of Representatives. But through some backroom dealing, Jefferson eventually is able to prevail in the election. But it's certainly not decided until early 1801, long after the November 1800 election.
Speaking of morals and what we've been talking about, let's go back to religion and your perspective. How much did he talk about religion during his lifetime and especially during his presidency?
Well, he talked a lot about religion throughout his life. He had to be very careful about what he said publicly about religion until he retired from politics, because, for instance, there were comments that he made in Notes on the State of Virginia, which is his only full-length book he ever published and comes out in the mid-1780s. There were comments that he made in that book that signaled his skepticism about Christianity and the Bible that were used against him. Those comments were used against him for the rest of his political career by people saying that he was a heretic, and people even said he was an atheist, which he was not an atheist, but people said that he was. Accused him, his rivals accused him of atheism, and so he knew that anything he said in public view about religion was almost certainly going to be used as a political weapon against him. So, for instance, in Notes on the State of Virginia, he questioned whether Noah's flood had really happened. And then related to the issue about race and slavery, he posited that maybe God had created the races at different times and different places, and that Africans were created at a different time from whites, and that would help to explain what he believed was African or African American inherent inferiority to whites. And this is hair-raising for a couple different reasons. I mean, one is obviously the racist implications of this, but it's also denying or at least raising the possibility that the creation story of Adam and Eve and all that in Genesis may not be true. And so to an electorate that is, broadly, traditionally Christian at the time, this was really disturbing stuff. And so he knew that any time he said anything like that was critical of the Bible or the Christian tradition, that it was likely to be used against him in the newspapers, in the campaigns. And so in the 1800 presidential election, Jefferson's personal religion was front and center as a political issue. And the idea was that John Adams, even though John Adams was more of a, liberal kind of Unitarian-leaning Christian, that John Adams has a much more reliable personal faith than Jefferson does. So until 1809, when he retires from politics, Jefferson has to be very careful. But there is a way in which his retirement frees him up to talk a lot more, still privately for the most part, but about theology and what he believes about Christian ethics. And it turns out that his most active conversation partner on those topics is John Adams. They had been estranged for about a decade after the 1800 presidential election, but some common friends broker a reconciliation between the two of them, and they end up writing many, many letters in the 18-teens to one another. And a lot of the time, the letters are covering what to us may seem pretty arcane theological topics. I mean, they're talking about the Trinity and why they don't believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. They're talking about prophecy and end times, scenarios, and why they're skeptical about some of the traditional views on those topics. They're talking about, the supernatural versus the material realm and all these kinds of things. They love talking about those kind of topics. And it's just fascinating to me to watch these two retired presidents. You would think all they would be talking about is politics, and they did talk about that, but they talked about theology together a lot. And so it was a common interest, definitely of Jefferson and Adams, but of many in the founding generation.
You have a quote from Thomas Jefferson in your book. I'll read it. Adore God, reverence and cherish your parents, love your neighbor as yourself, and your country more than life. Be just, be true, murmur not all the ways of providence, and the life into which you have entered will be the passage to one of eternal and ineffable bliss. Again, back to the morals question. What do you think Thomas Jefferson thought about the kind of life he was living, and what do you think in those days adoring God meant?
Yeah, I mean, I think that he probably tended to think he was doing about the best that he could, given the circumstances. I mean, I think that there's a lot of excusing his behavior with regard to, for instance, owning slaves. I mean, he said in Notes on the State of Virginia and at other times that he knew slavery was immoral. And yet he did not believe that it was feasible for him, partly because of his financial situation, but also just because he thought, emancipation of the slaves was a foolish thing to even consider. He thought that if you had mass emancipation of the slaves in the South, that it would lead immediately to a genocidal race war. And so he said at one point that, we have the wolf by the ear. We can't safely hold it. We can't safely let it go. And so he thought, it's all well and good to say slavery is immoral, but we can't really practically do anything to certainly to emancipate the slaves in any immediate fashion. So I think that Jefferson probably tended to think that he was doing about the best that he could. And that quote that you read, it was he said something to that effect to a number of children that he wrote to, and he tended, as a lot of people of that time would do. I mean, he tended to speak in a fairly moralistic kind of way to children, and also to women. He tended to give his daughters fairly conventional sounding, at least moralistic Christian advice. But it doesn't. It sits somewhat uneasily with his, well-developed skepticism about traditional Christian doctrine. I mean, he is really conflicted about all these kind of things. And as far as adoring God, it's very hard to say. I mean, I'm not sure I know what Jefferson would mean by adoring God. I mean, he had no problem with attending, church services, and regularly did that throughout his life, especially Anglican or Episcopalian church services. I think he thought there was something good about, at least being present for worship services. But he even seems to have had, he talked regularly in correspondence about praying for things. And so he's very skeptical about, traditional Christian doctrine, but he seems to have prayed regularly. And he said that he used the Jefferson Bible for personal devotions. And he seems to have read the Bible, especially the New Testament. He seems to have read the New Testament in Greek regularly for sort of personal edification. And so I think that he probably would have said that all that is in the name of adoring God, but that probably the most important thing he would say is that just living by, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the golden rule, that is the most practical way that we in this life can show our adoration for God.
When you talk about the fact that he was, on today's dollars, $2.6 million in debt, and this is in the same area where you're talking about his attitude about religion, then you read this. The highlight of the event, displayed in bold letters at the top of the ad, was, quote, 130 valuable Negroes. These were believed to be the most valuable for their number ever offered at one time in Virginia. So in other words, he dies and they sell 130 valuable Negroes in order to pay off the debt that he has for the main Monticello place and then the Poplar Forest place.
Yes, at that point, the decision has really been taken out of Jefferson's hands. I mean, not to let him off the hook, but by the time he co-signs this loan in the late 18 teens, and then the co-signer that he signed on behalf of dies, it is over for him financially, and that means that the way that he has lived all those years, and the lack of discipline and the enormous expenses associated often with diplomacy and presidential responsibilities, all that has come to a point where what he is going to do, most importantly with his enslaved people, is really out of his hands. The creditors are now in control. And so there is a sowing and reaping, to use another biblical phrase, principle that has come to pass for Jefferson and his estate and his enslaved people, that now there is no possibility, for the most part, of freeing these hundreds of people that he's enslaved. So it's a grim picture, and he really, I think, I'm sorry to say, I mean, it's really pathetic at the end, the way that his life wraps up, that he is in such desperate straits financially that he even tries to get the state of Virginia to hold a lottery for him to pay off his personal debts. And in fact, they authorize one, but it doesn't go very well. Not very many tickets sell. But just the idea that you would have the state, out of kind of gratitude to him, I suppose, for his political legacy, to hold a lottery specifically for his personal financial disarray is it's really it's a sad ending to a significant political career. That's for sure.
You have a footnote. I want to get your reaction to a footnote you have in the back. And this is from, let's make sure that somebody gets the right credit for it. I'm not sure. I'll read it because these are your words. Some scholars of his finances believe that Jefferson's indebtedness was ultimately due to mismanagement rather than profligacy. Jefferson admittedly did not engage in the kind of grotesque overspending that marked certain European royalty or aristocrats, but he struggled to make connections between his spending and his inability to pay down debt. Is there any other way to define what he did other than irresponsible?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the people who defend Jefferson about this, I think what they would say is that, especially as American minister in Paris and then as president, that he just had major expenses that were built into the nature of his job. And that's true. I mean, there's just no way around the fact that, I mean, the president in those days paid out of pocket his own household expenses. And Jefferson was not only was the president expected to be constantly hosting parties, but Jefferson did a lot of that as just a very fundamental political strategy for him. He wasn't a great public speaker. His writing and his ideas were great and profound, but he wasn't a particularly good public speaker. And so his way of exercising political influence was often hosting people at the president's mansion, and that entailed, having wine and food and the things that you would expect the president to offer. And so, I understand that defense of Jefferson, but a lot of what he was doing in terms of his own personal expenses really was irresponsible. He finishes Monticello, and then immediately tears the whole thing down and starts a second version of Monticello, which is much bigger and more lavish with lots of imported features and products and objects for display. And as soon as he finishes the second Monticello, he starts on an even more impractical mansion down around Lynchburg at Poplar Forest, which is, a nightmare in terms of the logistics and bringing stuff into rural frontier Virginia and just the enormous expenses associated with all that. And I mean, you could give many other examples of that type of spending. Given his financial straits, it is deeply irresponsible. So I think of course, you can look at different parts of what his spending habits were for and what they were like and say, well, this is more excusable than others. But there is a significant aspect that it's just grossly irresponsible, the way that he lives. And it has terrible effects, not least on his family and his enslaved people.
You point out, you say Jefferson also gave money to erect meeting houses for Episcopal, Presbyterian, and Baptist churches in Charlottesville. How was he able to do that if he was in such debt? Well,
that's another question about, why is he giving money to charity when he is now, in today's money, in millions of dollars of debt. But I think that it speaks to a lot of his expenses, including charitable giving or entertaining and hosting and things like that. He seems to have just believed that there was no option to act any other way. A gentleman in Virginia, I do think his sort of code of gentility is, when push comes to shove, I think that's what he tended to act upon the most consistently, was his sense of what a gentleman is required to do. And so in Jefferson's world, there is no option but for a gentleman to be charitable and generous. And when a longtime political ally asks you to co-sign a loan, you do it. You just have to, because the embarrassment of not doing that would be more that he could take. And so, again, it can be difficult getting into Jefferson's mind about why he kept living this way for so many decades. But that I think would be close to probably how he would think about it is that there's no choice involved here, that this is just simply the way that a Christian gentleman has to live, is through generosity and charity and spending even when you really don't have the money.
You point out on page 237 what he has on his gravestone. I can remember standing at the gravestone and having a tour guide say he was such a modest man that he didn't even put the fact that he was President of the United States on his gravestone. And here's what is on the gravestone, as you say: author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. What's your take on why he didn't want his the fact on there that he'd been President of the United States for 8 years?
Well, I do think that there probably is a sense for Jefferson that holding political office is not his primary legacy. And I think that's probably true. I mean, he certainly had some major accomplishments as president, most obviously the Louisiana Purchase. But his second term did not go very well at all. And I think he saw being in political office as a sort of grubby reality, but that his contribution was going to be more on the level of ideas. So, the principles of the Declaration, and then religious liberty and the Virginia Statute, and then education, and his dream of having UVA as a great educational institution for Virginia gentlemen. But of course, that even his gravestone is a stylized presentation of himself as a gentleman intellectual, and that it would be somewhat unseemly, I guess, for him to say, well, I was president. I mean, and I think Jefferson, if he thought about it, would know. Everybody knows that. Does he have to mention it? I suppose you might say that about the Declaration too. But those were the contributions I think that he genuinely was the most passionate about and probably proudest of. And so I think that's probably what he was thinking. And then there's maybe a certain modesty in that, but it's a stylized modesty.
Why did you decide to leave Baylor and teach people who want to become ministers in Kansas City?
Yeah, I mean, it's different for me, going from teaching a lot of undergraduates and graduate students in history to teaching, mostly pastors, seminarians, future missionaries, and church history. But it's an exciting opportunity. There's a lot of issues that are constantly in the news about struggles of the churches with issues about politics and being thoughtful about the American past and so forth. And I just find it exciting, as a person who's committed to the church myself, and concerned about helping with those sorts of struggles that American churches seem to have. How wonderful to be able to actually work directly with pastors who are on the front lines of all these kind of, culture war type issues and ministering to their congregations in a thoughtful and intelligent and faithful way. I thought this is an exciting opportunity for me to be able to kind of engage with the people who are going to be on the front lines of the church for the next generation. It was just an exciting prospect for me.
Where are you from originally?
From South Carolina originally, but we lived a lot of different places when I was growing up.
What did you take away from your experience at Clemson?
Well, diehard Clemson football fan. That's for sure. And that was a deal where given the nature of my family, I could go 4 years to whatever public school was the best choice for me, and some of my best friends had already gone to Clemson, and so I decided to go there. But I was, I'm a product of the South Carolina public school system for good and bad, and so my intellectual awakening, that led me to become a professor really came. I would say midway through my time at Clemson with some really great professors who kind of inspired me to think about ideas in the past and studying that, and then maybe eventually going on to teach in that area.
time to wrap it up, but I have one last question for you. When I say that, I may have one after that one. But my last question is, and clearly after spending 10 days with your book, I want to ask you, because you are a religious man, with Thomas Jefferson in mind, how would you define Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this comes down to a question of whether there is an Orthodox, small o Orthodox Christian tradition or not. And Jefferson clearly did not believe that if there is one, that we have it in sort of institutional Christianity. I tend to think that there is such a thing as sort of small o Orthodox historic Christian tradition that's found first and foremost in the Bible, but in the great traditional creeds and affirmations and confessions of the church. And so, I think Jefferson is doing something that's similar to the kind of thing that Franklin did too. And so it wasn't an unusual thing in that kind of Enlightenment moment of the American founding to see if you can create a fundamentally ethical version of Christianity and set the supernatural claims aside. And there are all kinds of ways in human history to mess up religion. That's for sure. But I think that in Jefferson's case, the attempt to create a sort of individualized, purely ethical version of Christianity, we can at least say that it didn't have much effect on the way that he lived. So I don't find personally his kind of version of Christianity as encapsulated in the Jefferson Bible to be very satisfying or persuasive.
This book is published by Yale. The name of it is Thomas Jefferson, A Biography of Spirit and Flesh. And our guest is Thomas S. Kidd, Professor of History. Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.